Hey guys, welcome back to another reaction video. Today we're going to be reacting to completely wrong history facts that you may still believe. I've never seen this video and I've never seen this channel, so I really don't have any idea what to expect, but sounds interesting. The animation looks kind of fun, so hopefully it's good. If you like it and you want to see more from this channel, I'll leave the original video link in the description below, so go ahead and check it out. But let's jump right into it.
History facts that are wrong.
The ancient Egyptian pyramids were built by slaves. This is a very common myth that a lot of people still believe in. It's very unlikely the pyramids were built by slaves. A big reason for this is one, it was a way to pay off your taxes if you just worked on the pyramids. Instead of paying your taxes if you didn't have the money to, you could work to build monuments. The Egyptians were always building massive monuments, statues, pyramids, all kinds of crazy monuments, and you could pay taxes by working for the government to build these monuments. That's one. The second one is that the pyramids were so technically complicated and the work was so extreme, you would not want malnourished, struggling slaves putting this together. They were already really complicated to build. You didn't want mistakes happening from slaves that weren't putting the best effort into their work, which is just a common thing throughout history. Slaves result in worse quality work. So for these pyramids to be as grand and just as incredible as they were, it was most likely paid labor that built these.
This is probably one of the first things we all learned about in school when discussing ancient Egypt. Tens of thousands of slaves enduring endless hours of intense, forced physical labor while barely being fed or provided with adequate water. Drop a sack of sand, chisel something at the wrong angle, devout masochist, you're getting a whipping. Well, it's all poppycock. While there were slaves, they were mainly prisoners of war or household servants who tended to their landlords, but they weren't really part of the main labor force. Instead, laborers in ancient Egypt were conscripted using the corvée duty system, a way to pay out taxes through manual labor. According to the book The Pyramid Builders of Ancient Egypt, which discusses the pyramid builders of ancient Egypt, farmers were usually pulled from their laborious crop dusting for construction work whenever the Nile went all floody during the summer months. While the snobby rich upper class folk avoided manual labor by just paying off their tax burden, them smelly poors were tasked with construction of temples, tombs, and pyramids.
Yeah, that's a good point to make. If you're rich, you would never see a rich man out there building the pyramid. That was something that was beneath them. They could just pay the taxes and get out of doing the heavy lifting. But if you couldn't pay the taxes, you were out there working very, very, very hard, long hours to make these pyramids.
Laborers who worked on the pyramids, as well as other large structures way back in the ancient times, were actually well provided for. This makes sense, as having a weakened labor force due to neglect or malnourishment, it doesn't really pay great dividends. Can't exactly move giant rocks when you're completely emaciated. Small villages have been discovered built specifically for housing laborers. These sites also contain various animal bones and plentiful bread jars.
That's so cool if they found those.
Diet. But of course, the system wasn't perfect. Thanks to some classic upper-class corruption, sometimes things didn't always go right for these laborers, but they had the power to stand their ground. Dating all the way back to 1170 BC, written evidence has been found of an artisan's strike while constructing a tomb for then-pharaoh Ramesses III. The artisans complained about a lack of promised rations and outright refused to continue their work, dropping their chisels and their hammers to march right up to the ruling class's temples to make their demands. What do we want? Food! When do we want it? Food! After chit-chatting...
That's really cool. I didn't even know that happened. That's really, really cool that they actually found writing that showed that happened. And remember, that's 3,000 years ago. That's incredible that they even have evidence of that happening.
With the local vizier, the workers were able to secure their rations and continued their work.
Worked.
Don't get me wrong, the labor that these guys endured was backbreaking, extremely strenuous, and downright exhausting. But they weren't outright enslaved or mistreated, as historians previously thought.
I wonder, probably not, but I wonder if that's the first known instance of a strike happening, or at least a successful strike happening in history. That's a long ways back. King Tut's tomb is cursed. I mean, obviously, if you believe this, then there's not a lot of hope for you. There is no cursed King Tut's tomb. But it was, whenever it was found, it was one of the earliest Egyptian tombs discovered that was not raided by grave robbers, which is why it's so famous. King Tut was a very insignificant pharaoh. I believe he reigned until he was 18 years old. He was extremely deformed from genetic issues because his family was very inbred. Um, so he wasn't a very great ruler. But the reason he's remembered as some famous pharaoh is just because his tomb was completely intact when they found it,
Heard
which
the
is pretty
legends
cool.
about King Tut's tomb, right? If you disturb an ancient king's burial grounds, you'll be cursed, doomed to die a horrible death. Well, it's not so. You'd probably cough a bit from inhaling millennial-old mummy powder, but that's about it. Now, there has been evidence of some ancient tombs inscribed with curse-like carvings. For example, ancient warlord and Egyptian noble Ankh-Tifi wrote that, quote, "Any ruler who shall do evil or wickedness to his coffin, may the gods not accept any goods he offers, and may his heir never inherit."
Oh,
Similarly,
man.
an inscription on the tomb of 10th century BC ruler Kentika Ikeki warns that any impure men who enter this tomb, there will be judgment. An end shall be made for him. I shall seize his neck like a bird, and I shall cast the fear of myself into him. Now,
Don't think he can do that because he's dead.
in a culture that was super superstitious, anyone coming across warnings like that would be like,
Oh shit! A ghost!
prompting them to 180 right out of the room. When King Tut's tomb was discovered in 1922, no such written reprimands or warnings were ever found. In reality, the rumor of King Tut's curse revolves around one George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, 5th Earl of Carnarvon, a rich English
What a
white dude
name.
who funded the whole expedition that led to the discovery of the Sandy sarcophagus. He died a whole 4 months after the opening of the tomb, after which a journalist did what journalists do and printed a whole bunch of sensationalized fake news, attributing Lord Carnarvon's death to an
It sells-
inexplicable curse. To no surprise, the media ran with it, making claims of a written curse being uncovered with the tomb, though this never happened.
Also, one thing you got to know: in the early 20th century, Egyptian culture was super popular around the world. It was rabid how popular Egyptian stuff was in the UK and in America. It was everywhere. It got so popular. They probably won't mention this, but it got so popular. They were bringing back so much Egyptian stuff back to England because they were basically colonizing Egypt. It got so popular that they were bringing back mummies to England, and people were eating the goo that came out of the mummies because they thought it had health benefits, which is disgusting. Basically, it's just cannibalism. It's disgusting. But yeah, the popularity of Egyptian stuff during this period is just really, really insane to learn about, which is probably why this curse thing ever took off the ground in the first place. But it's interesting too because it's not just in this era that the Egyptian popularity craze happened. It also happened to the Romans. When the Romans conquered Egypt, they also had their own crazy Egyptian phase where they started bringing back everything Egyptian that they possibly could. If you go to Rome today, you'll still see these beautiful red columns that are in the ruins of some of the ancient Roman ruins that's still there today. And a lot of the red columns that you see are actually from Egypt. They just went and took them out of Egypt and put them in Rome just because they loved Egyptian stuff. Just keeps happening throughout history. People just love Egypt.
So how did Lord Carnarvon die? He done got bit by a mosquito. The resulting
Malaria.
bump was accidentally
So it is.
slashed while he was shaving, making a pretty nasty cut that later got infected.
Ugh,
The old chap died of blood poisoning at the age of 56.
Didn't know that.
Dedicated believers have tried to attribute other deaths to the curse, but they're really grasping for straws. Of the 58 people who were present at the opening of the tomb, only 8 had died within a dozen years of the discovery, and by various means ranging from cancer to murder to natural causes. The majority of the men went to live on full, healthy lives. At least they didn't steal any spooky slabs. That might have been a different story.
Spartans threw babies off a cliff.
When you think of Spartans, you probably think about them slippery, shiny hunks of warrior man meat as portrayed on the silver screen. A society of strict and viciously trained bloodthirsty warriors who could decimate any opposing army. But while you're thinking about oiled up, shirtless, muscular men, you might question if this portrayal is historically accurate. It's not. In reality, the Greek city-state of Sparta had no professional army. Although growing up with militaristic training, the purpose was not
Well,
to
nudity
create
going on.
warriors, but perfected, hardened, and respectable citizens who could serve to defend their homeland if need be. That little element of perfection is where some rumors of Spartan eugenics come in. It is believed that ancient Spartans practiced infanticide, the act of killing deformed or undesired babies as a way to strengthen the Spartan society. However, the biggest downfall of this myth is that there's only one historical source that alludes to this barbaric practice, and it's this guy, Roman historian Plutarch. He wrote that Spartan elders would examine newborns for imperfections or weaknesses. Good, good, bad, good. What the? Hello, Daddy. Ew. If any were ever found, they would just yeetus the fetus off the Taygetus mountainside. This ensured that only the best of the best would be able to thrive to crushing adulthood. But this bit of literature is almost certainly a bunch of baloney. While historians can't confirm with 100% certainty, they can confirm with 99.9% certainty that this just flat out never happened. Excavations around the proposed baby hucking sites have failed to present any supporting evidence. There have been a few adult remains.
I don't know about the Spartans, but I know the Romans had a cliff that they would execute people off of. If you were accused criminal and you were sentenced to die, the Romans did have a cliff outside of Rome that they would throw people off of. I can't remember the name of the cliff off the top of my head. You know what? Give me a second. I'll look it up. Yeah, okay. So I found it. It's the Tarpeian Rock, which I knew the cliff exists and I'd heard the Tarpeian Rock. It just slipped my mind in the moment. But yeah, the Tarpeian Rock was a giant rock that they would throw criminals off of. It says here, adjudicated murderers, traitors, perjurers, and larcenous slaves, if convicted by the Quaestros Puricidi, were flung from the cliff to their deaths. The cliff was about 25 meters or 80 feet high. Here's a picture of it. It's pretty crazy. But anyways, back to the video.
But no teeny tiny toddler tibias were ever among them. If you needed more convincing, Plutarch's writings date some 600 years after the height of Spartan civilization. So it might have just been some silly Spartan slander.
That's where a lot of misinformation comes from throughout history. It's really, really important when you're studying history to know the difference between primary and secondary sources. Primary sources are much more likely to be true than secondary sources because a lot of times you'll have people that, like in this case, are writing 600 years past the event that's happened and writing about it like it's fact. You don't know for a fact what happened without reading, without proper research. You're not going to know for a fact what happened 600 years in the past. You can't just write something and it be true. You weren't there. You don't know. And sometimes secondary sources will be true. You got to use a lot of research is verifying if secondary sources are true. But you can't just take one secondary source and say, "Oh, then it happened." You're not going to find the truth that way. It takes multiple sources to find the truth.
It'd be like if future archaeologists in the year 4000 unearthed fan fiction from today about how medieval Europeans would just shoot their britches to ward off witches. Sure, it's questionable, but you could kind of see that happening, right?
Gladiators fought to the death. Yeah, that is not true.
You may think death was
very rarely did they do that.
Gladiator battles in the Roman Colosseum. If it was, Rome would have run out of them real quick.
True.
Now keep in mind that the Colosseum was active for over 400 years, hosting a plethora of different events ranging from gladiator battles to public criminal executions to full-fledged naval battle reenactments, with the entire Colosseum being flooded.
Okay, so Colosseum is incredible. Gladiator fights are amazing. Gladiators are basically the equivalent of superstar athletes in American society today, like the biggest NFL superstars that there are, or NBA or whatever sport you want. If you go to Rome and go to the Colosseum, they actually have this whole display inside the Colosseum where they still have artifacts where Romans would buy memorabilia that had pictures of their favorite gladiator that they supported. Kind of like how you would go and buy a Tom Brady jersey. You could go and buy like a plate and it would have a picture of the gladiator that you really liked. Or you could buy a cup with his picture on it. All kinds of cool things that you could buy. And they still have a lot of the artifacts that are still there. And you can still see the gladiator and his name below it. Gladiators were incredibly popular. And it made Romans tons and tons of money. This was their big money bringer for the Roman city. People would come from all outside of the Roman city to come watch these gladiators fight. And it wasn't just Rome. You had Colosseums all across the empire. So they wouldn't want their gladiators to die all the time. That's just losing money. So they frequently would end the fight before any deaths happened because they didn't want to lose gladiators. But they did have fights to the death on occasion, but it wasn't as common as a lot of people believe. It's probably because of movies like The Gladiator, which is a great movie, by the way.
Pretty wild, right? Well, gladiator battles were basically the equivalent of today's UFC or boxing matches, just with swords and spears instead of fists.
Which is
These
awesome.
fights were spectacles of sport, and the gladiators were the athletes. You had some super famous gladiators, rookie gladiators, and everything in between.
Oh, and you also had different types of gladiators. If you look, there's all kinds of different armor that the gladiators would wear, and it was all like the different rules that they would have in the gladiator fights, which is pretty interesting.
While some gladiators were slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war fighting for their chance of freedom, most of the big old brutes fought for fame and fortune, or just the high-octane dopamine rush of being able to legally stab someone in the kidney and getting praised for it. Roman citizens were hyped to watch two dudes duke it out in a sweaty, sandy, sassy struggle of strength. But things were a lot more exciting than just the vanilla missionary position 9-to-5 white picket fence 1.5 children-ass sword and shield type gladiators. Nope. Actually, there were about 30 different types of gladiators ready to clang and bang away at each other.
Yeah.
You had your dual-wielding Demochirus, the
Exactly what I was saying a minute ago.
the silly-looking Caesar, and the alls-out, balls-out Cestus, among other DLC characters. So imagine that you're living your boring Roman life, sitting in your boring Roman house, scratching your boring Roman balls, when you suddenly catch wind of the gladiator battle of the century. Two andabate pitted against each other. You'd lose your shit. Why would you lose your shit? Because andabate were condemned criminals fighting each other completely blind.
Wow, that's pretty cool. Yeah, they had some crazy events in the gladiator fights to try to bring people in. I know in some instances they would take criminals that were condemned to die, and they would be an active participant in this show. And these criminals knew that at the end of the show, they were going to die. It was the grand finale. But they would bring in these criminals, they would participate in the show, and then in some of these shows, they would load the criminals up in catapults and launch them across the Colosseum to smack into a wall. Or they would let an animal rip them apart in front of everybody. It was just all for show. It was a mad bloodlust craze that the Romans had to watch these gladiators. And they would have these shows performing at an incredible level. They were like all about maximum entertainment. It's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, as a form of punishment, two criminals equipped with nothing more than a sealed helmet and a rusty sword were dumped out into the arena and forced to square off. It's like watching two blindfolded kids trying to whack at a piñata.
That's crazy.
Except they're both potential piñatas. Now, while formal gladiator duels were not to the death, of course some still died. But it was more common to die by bleeding out after the match had been called by the referee. Oh yeah, they had referees. These were often retired gladiators tasked with making sure that the rules of battle were being followed and stopping fights before final blows were dealt. You see, gladiators were expensive investments, so their managers wanted them alive for as long as possible, lest they start all over leveling up another rookie from scratch. So with all that being said, professional gladiator battles were not performed for the sake of death, just for the thrill of the fight, and the potential of death.
Nero fiddled as Rome burned.
Ancient myths are tough for modern historians to interpret, as historical writers across...
Fun fact, the Colosseum is actually built on a giant pool that Nero had built for himself. The Romans were trying to move past Nero, so I can't remember which emperor it was. I'd have to look it up. But the Roman emperor that came after Nero, he wanted to move Rome past Nero because everyone hated Nero. So to cover up some of his vain architecture, he decided to build the Colosseum for the people and place it right on top of a pool that Nero had built to kind of show the Romans that, hey, I am an emperor and I'm not going to be like Nero. I'm going to build things for you. And he actually used some of the gold that they got from the sacking of Jerusalem to build the Colosseum.
Time have their own biases. Depending on how they felt about a certain historical figure, they could cement their legacy in history as a smart fella or a fart smella. The prevailing myth that Roman Emperor Nero diddled his fiddle as Rome burned to the ground is one that should go up in smoke.
Yeah, this is probably not
It's
true.
commonly believed that Nero, having descended into madness over the course of his reign, started the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD.
It's important to remember, Nero was not just a terrible tyrant his entire reign. For the first couple of years of his reign, he was actually a pretty good emperor, and the Romans loved him. He, unfortunately, just went crazy. I'm not sure what was wrong with him, but he did fall to insanity, and he just got worse and worse until the point where he was just nuts.
A disastrous and destructive inferno that destroyed nearly 3/4 of the Roman capital. Accusations claim that Nero didn't really like the look of Rome and wanted to rebuild it in his own vision with a lavish and gaudy golden palace. So a conveniently timed fire would have been a great opportunity to do so.
And during this period, a lot of Rome was wood. I know a lot of people have this view that Rome is just all marble and all this crazy stuff. It wasn't early on. It was a lot of it was wood. It wasn't until after this fire and later that a lot of these buildings started to be replaced with the concrete and marble buildings that you know and love today. I think this myth that Nero played his fiddle is because Nero was obsessed with the arts. He wanted to be an artist, like some other dictators that we know in history. But he would actually sneak away from the palace and go out into the countryside and play, I think it was a flute or I don't remember what instrument it was, but he'd go and play instruments out for the public, dressed in a disguise. No one would know it was Nero, but he would go and try to entertain people because his heart was he wanted to be an entertainer. I don't know if you all wanted to be an emperor as much.
The fire is suspected to have started in a shopping district stockpiled with flammable goods. Once the fire started, it was nearly impossible to contain. Rome was a dense city. Streets were narrow, housing structures were wooden, and the wind was a-blowin'. This set of conditions provided the perfect environment for the big old fire to really roar. The blaze lasted for 9 whole days.
In that picture, you see the Colosseum. The Colosseum was not there yet.
Decimating 10 of Rome's 14 districts.
That's a
But
lot.
Was Emperor Nero to blame? Not at all. According to Tacitus, one of the most influential Roman historians at the time, Nero was not near Rome when the fire started. He was actually several miles away in the coastal town of Antium, but he rushed back home to Rome once he caught wind of the disaster. When he did get back, Nero actually funded relief efforts and opened up private gardens and other structures for shelter to those affected. Despite these efforts, Nero still came under scrutiny from the nobles who hated him, claiming that he should have responded sooner and provided more assistance.
Freaking Nero, dude. I bet my scorched ass cheeks he started that fire himself.
Yeah, you're right. He probably did.
Guys, he was literally miles away in another city.
What did you do?
And that's how rumors start. In actual fact, there is no historical evidence that Nero started the fire, and especially no evidence that he played the fiddle when Rome burned. Mostly because the fiddle wouldn't be invented for another 900 years. It's probable that the claim is part of Christian propaganda, as Nero famously blamed them for the fire, leading to their persecution. So who really got the last laugh? It was Nero. He burned a lot of Christians.
He did. He would actually, he would bring Christians in and bring them around his dinner table and light them on fire, and he would use them as lighting for his dinners, which is crazy. Killed a lot of innocent people. Ancient Aztecs thought Spaniards were gods.
It's possible that
This is something I've heard a lot, and I'm really interested to see what he says
middle school
about it.
history textbooks may have toyed with the idea that ancient Aztecs, or even the greater Mexican people as a whole, saw the invading Spanish conquistadors.
I'm pretty sure they
as
taught me that in
godlike
school when I was a
figures.
kid,
More
too.
specifically, history has suggested that the Aztec ruler Moctezuma, or Montezuma, however you want to pronounce it, believed that the arrival of the Spanish coincided with the prophesied return of Quetzalcoatl, the Mesoamerican feathered serpent god of creation. But we now know that it's all, as the Spanish say, a bunch of caca. It's certainly true that the native Mexican people were stunned and confused by the appearance of the foreign invaders with their fancy horses, gunpowder, and white skin, but there's no evidence explicitly stating that they were thought of as gods. Letters written by Hernan Cortés himself about his conquests never mention being mistaken for or being interpreted as a god in any way, shape, or form. And this is further supported by the writings of Spanish conquistador Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who chronicled Cortez's conquests in real time. One passage highlights a conversation between Cortez and Moctezuma in the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan. Conversation basically had Moctezuma being like, yeah, people around here think I'm a god, that I'm all about gold and silver and precious stones, but look, you see that? Flesh and blood, my dude. We're both the same. I know that you're just a bunch of foreigners and not some otherworldly divine beings. That would just be silly. To which Cortez replied, so where did this idea come from? Well, it actually started to surface decades after the Aztecs were conquered. Publication.
Okay, side note, I'm not sure if he's going to mention this or not. A lot of people try to portray it like it was just Hernan Cortez and his band of Spaniards that conquered the Aztecs. That's only partly true. The Aztecs were a very brutal empire, and they made a ton of enemies around them. They conquered and were very brutal to the people they conquered, and it didn't just end with them being... The brutality didn't just end when you were conquered. They constantly wanted to come back and be brutal to you over and over and over again. So when Hernan Cortez shows up with his technology and his tactics, and he shows the people that there is a way to bring down the Aztec Empire, he got a lot of people on his side very quickly. So he had an army of thousands of Native Americans against these Aztecs. So it wasn't just Hernan Cortez and his Spaniards. It was a whole bunch of people that brought down the Aztecs.
Of Spanish conquest alluded to the idea that Cortez and his men tried to pass their weapons off as magic and their horses off as intelligent, aggressive beasts. So it was mainly a sensationalized retelling of events, portraying the Mexican people as more feeble-minded, all while embellishing the Spanish image.
As it turns out, the Aztec weren't bamboozled by some distrustful deity. The Spanish completely steamrolled the Aztec with the help of guns, alliances to Aztec rivals, and every European explorer's iconic weapon, disease.
It was less.
And diseases are brutal. Like, that's something that's, I wouldn't say it's overlooked, but a lot of people don't really fully understand the impact of it. Is that when the Europeans were coming to the Americas, the impact that disease had on the Native Americans is astronomically just terrible. A lot of people look at like the bubonic plague and the Spanish flu, but a lot of people don't mention the epidemics that happened with the Native Americans. But I believe the number is like upwards of 90%, something like that, of the Native American population that was just wiped off the face of the earth in just a couple of years because of diseases that were brought over from the Europeans. The Europeans would go into these villages that they had discovered years before. They would come in, Spanish explorers would come into the Americas. They would find these villages, that they would map out these villages that they had found. And then a few years later, they would come back to try to make contact with these villages again, and all of them would be gone. Because whenever they came through the first time, their diseases that the Native Americans had not come in contact with before and didn't have immunities to, it would just rampage through the population. And millions and millions and millions of Native Americans just died. There were stories where Spaniards would come into these cities that they had come across, like these magnificent Native American cities, and they would walk into the cities just a few years later, and the ground would just be bleach white from all of the bones that were just littering on the street because the entire city died from diseases. It's crazy that not many people know about it today.
Oh my God. And more.
Oh my God!
In 1929, market crash.
Depression
Oh,
was truly
I didn't see that.
My God!
In 1929, market crash caused the Great Depression. It's not the sole reason.
The Great Depression was truly a financial disaster, not only
a lot
for
of
the
reasons.
US, but for the entire globe. Most of you out there might recall learning that the stock market crash of 1929 caused the
Yep.
Great Depression, but in reality, it was just the signal that shit had hit the financial fan.
Yeah, the Great Depression was far too big to just attribute to one thing. That's unrealistic.
Nothing more than a devastating effect from a much more threatening.
There's a lot of stuff that
underlying
went in the Great
cause.
Depression.
If you're unaware, the world economy is a constant struggle for balance of supply and demand, with price being the end result. Lots of demand and no supply, prices go up. Lots of supply but no buyers, prices go down. Sure, that's a bit oversimplified, but you get the idea. The Great Depression was
I
a
see what you did there.
catastrophic chain of events stemming from U.S. overproduction of goods. You see, in the early 1920s, the world had entered a time of peace at the end of World War I. This led to an industrial boom. Not for war machines, but for consumer goods. Mass production was going wild, and factories were farting out new products like crazy. To sell these products, companies began aggressive advertising campaigns. The news, radio, magazines, and everything just screamed in your face to buy the latest and greatest doohickey. And the people did. But how could customers afford all of this lavish spending?
Yep, the establishment of consumer credit.
Cars, appliances, clothes, homes, all purchased on credit. But the United States was not the only
Okay, this is off the top of my head, but if I remember correctly, there's a story that during this period, land in Florida was incredibly cheap. That people were buying land before they would ever saw the land, and they would buy the land and move down and be surprised about what they actually owned. There's stories of people buying land in Florida, and they would get down there, and they literally had nothing. It would just be a bunch of water. So they would just be standing in knee-deep water. The buying craze that was going on in the 1920s was astronomical. The economy was growing so fast, and it just didn't keep up.
beneficiary of a peacetime economy. European and
The
Asian
Roaring
markets
20s.
began producing their own goods, selling these products to the US for cheaper prices, which caught the eyes of consumers looking to save a few pennies here and there. The big American companies, seeing potential profits leaving their grubby hands, were pissed and lobbied Congress to protect their interests. In order to do so, the Fordney-McCumber Tariff of 1922 was passed. This raised American tariffs across the board, increasing the consumer cost of foreign goods as to thin out the competition and force Americans to buy American products. Europe and Asia promptly responded in kind, and soon a tariff war commenced. All this sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it?
It does.
Now, in order to keep a
Not a
super
fan of
long
tariff
story
wars.
super
Tariff
short,
wars.
here's what happened next. Demand shrank as American companies and farms overproduced their goods. Too much stuff and no one to buy it means less sales. Less sales means less profit for these companies, and with less company profit, that means they're going to start handing out some pink slips. With lots of people laid off, lots of people have less money to spend, so companies lose even more money, and if they lose enough of it, they go bankrupt. Now, when companies went bankrupt, at least back in the 1920s, the banks that supported them failed. And when the banks failed, people's money straight up vanished, thanks to the lack of FDIC.
You can see how this is getting
insurance.
worse and worse.
Everyone loses their shit and rushes to withdraw money from whatever banks are still standing, but there's not enough physical cash to meet that demand. Now, all of a sudden, no one has money. So what happened to it all? The banks lent it out to all the rich people, placing speculative bets on the stock market. Now, when there's a lot of market speculation, stock market prices get unreasonably high. Unreasonably high prices aren't very sexy, so no one else wants to buy them. Instead, they sell to take profits. But when these profits are taken, that stock price drops. When stock prices drop, any remaining shareholders lose potential profit, which is no bueno. So they panic sell whatever shares they have. And when there's enough seller momentum across the board, the entire stock market crashes. So banks have failed, blue-collar workers have lost their life savings overnight, millionaires have lost their fortunes, factories have folded, and farmers have hung up their tools. Not only did this cripple the United States, but the entirety of global trade. The United States could not meet critical export demands, and foreign economies selling raw materials such as sugar, rubber, and lumber lost their biggest customer, and thus most of their money, impacting their economies. The Great Depression was without doubt one of the worst economic disasters of the modern age. The American economy struggled until the United States entered World War II.
Yeah, that's true. That's something a lot of people don't know. America did not come out of the Great Depression until our economy got mobilized for World War II, which kind of eliminated unemployment because 11 million soldiers or 11 million people went in to go fight in World War II. There's actually some really interesting pictures you can find online. There's a picture of just shacks built all across Central Park in New York City because no one could afford a house and they were stuck in the city, so they just put up shacks all across Central Park. Or like this picture, I'm not sure what this is, but yeah, shacks were everywhere. People started buying, or they started making patches into like sacks of potatoes and flowers and stuff like that, and women would start making clothing for their children out of just sackcloths and start patching their clothes from these sackcloths that was for potatoes and flowers. It's a really devastating time, and it's a really good thing that we got out of that.
In 1941, where demand for production and labor picked right back up. To put it simply, the 1929 stock market crash did not cause the Great Depression. It was the writing on the wall that the system was breaking. Afterward, the banking system was overhauled and the stock market heavily regulated to prevent history from repeating itself. And we'll see how that goes.
So far,
Well, that's the end of this
found
video.
a
Did you
good-
learn something new?
Yeah, I'm out of
I
Great
hope
Depression.
so.
Yeah, so I really liked that video. It was a really good video. The humor in it was really funny. I appreciated it. Like I said, I'll link the original video in the description below. So be sure to check him out. I will definitely watch some more videos of this guy. I really liked it, and he knew his stuff. That was really good. Thanks for watching, guys, and I hope you all have a great day, and I'll see you guys in the next one.